The ground in Ashbourne hadn't seen rain in 8 grueling months. When Clara Jensen took a rusted crowbar to her grandfather's boarded-up well, the local farmers gathered around the property line just to laugh. They thought she was digging for dust. They didn't know she was unearthing a town-shattering secret. The Nebraska sun beat down on the Miller farm like a physical weight, baking the topsoil into a pale, cracked mosaic that crumbled to powder underfoot. For 3 consecutive generations, the Miller family had pulled corn and soybeans from this earth, but now there was nothing but brittle stalks and silence. Clara Jensen stood on the porch of the farmhouse, wiping a mixture of sweat and grit from her forehead. At 32, she was a world away from the air-conditioned accounting firm in Chicago, where she had spent the last decade of her life. When her grandfather, Arthur Miller, passed away unexpectedly in the spring, he left her the 300-acre property, a mountain of agricultural debt, and a handwritten note that simply read, "Hold the land. No matter how dry it gets, do not sell to O'Connor." It was a directive that was proving impossible to follow. The drought of 2024 had brought the county of Ashbourne to its knees. The water table had plummeted, the local reservoirs were reduced to muddy puddles, and the bank was threatening foreclosure by the end of the month. Thomas O'Connor, the patriarch of the neighboring mega-farm, had already made his move. A wealthy, ruthless operator who had been swallowing up family farms for pennies on the dollar, O'Connor possessed the deep pockets necessary to truck in water from 3 counties over. He had parked his silver pickup truck at the edge of Clara's driveway 3 times in the past 2 weeks, offering her a meager buyout that would barely cover the grandfather's outstanding loans. "You're a city girl, Clara," Thomas had drawled just a day earlier, leaning against his truck with a smug, pitying smile. "You don't know the first thing about soil tissue or drought management. This land is dead. Your grandfather was a stubborn old fool who didn't know when to fold, and now you're holding a worthless hand. Take the check before the bank takes it all." But Clara was her grandfather's granddaughter, stubborn, fiercely independent, and driven by a quiet desperation. She had spent her evenings poring over Arthur's chaotic financial ledgers and personal diaries, searching for any hidden assets or forgotten insurance policies. Instead, at the bottom of a cedar chest in the attic, she found a leather-bound journal dating back to 1988. The entries were erratic, detailing a severe drought that had mirrored the current crisis. But it was the entry from August 14th, 1988, that made Clara's breath hitch. "The Eastfield well is sealed. I capped it with iron and poured concrete over the bolts. The county thinks it dried up. Let them think it. The water is gone, but what I found down there cannot see the light of day. It is a curse. It stays buried." Clara sat in the suffocating heat of the attic, staring at the page. The Eastfield well. She remembered it from her childhood summers, a massive circular concrete slab hidden behind a thicket of dead blackberry bushes, wrapped in heavy logging chains. Her grandfather had always told her it was toxic, contaminated by a chemical spill in the 70s. But if it was just a dry, contaminated well, why the secrecy? Why the heavy iron, the concrete, the dramatic journal entry? And more importantly, could there still be an untapped aquifer beneath it? If the well tapped into a deeper, forgotten subterranean reservoir, it could save the farm. It could save everything. The next morning, Clara loaded her grandfather's rusted pickup with a sledgehammer, a heavy-duty crowbar, bolt cutters, and a winch. As she drove out to the east field, the dust trailing behind her truck caught the attention of the neighbors. By the time Clara had hacked her way through the dead blackberry bushes and stood before the imposing concrete cap, she wasn't alone. Word traveled fast in Ashbourne. Thomas O'Connor's silver truck was parked on the county road, and beside him were 3 other local farmers: Bill Henderson, who ran the local feed store, and the 2 Lawson brothers, whose own crops were failing. They leaned against the wire fence, passing around a thermos of coffee, openly treating Clara's desperate endeavor as a morning theater performance. "Hey, Clara," Bill called out, chuckling. "You planning to find oil down there? Because I can promise you, Arthur's old well has been bone dry since Reagan was in office." "Leave her be, Bill," Thomas O'Connor said loudly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let the girl work off her grief. Nothing like swinging a hammer at solid concrete to teach a city accountant about the realities of rural life. When she's done breaking her back, maybe she'll finally sign those papers." Clara ignored them. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a potent mix of adrenaline and fury. She approached the well. It was massive, nearly 8 feet in diameter. The cap wasn't just wood. It was a thick plate of industrial iron, bolted into a concrete lip, wrapped in rusted steel chains, secured by 3 heavy-duty brass padlocks. Arthur hadn't just closed this well. He had entombed it. Clara grabbed the bolt cutters. The metal was old and brittle from decades of brutal Nebraska winters and scorching summers. She clamped the massive jaws onto the first padlock and threw her entire body weight onto the handles. With a sharp metallic crack, the lock gave way. A ripple of laughter echoed from the fence line. "Careful now," one of the Lawson brothers yelled. "Arthur used to say that well was cursed. You might let out a ghost." Clara moved to the second lock, then the third. Her palms were already blistering, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Once the chains fell away, she picked up the sledgehammer. The iron cap was bolted down, but the concrete holding the bolts had cracked over the years. She raised the heavy hammer and brought it down on the concrete lip with a deafening crack. Dust plumed into the air. She swung again and again. Her shoulders burned, her vision blurred with sweat. But the mocking laughter from the fence only fueled her strikes. She was fighting the drought. She was fighting the bank. She was fighting Thomas O'Connor. After 40 minutes of grueling, bone-jarring labor, the concrete casing around the iron bolts crumbled. Clara dropped the sledgehammer, panting, and grabbed the crowbar. She wedged the forged steel tip beneath the edge of the iron cap and pushed down with everything she had. There was a screech of rusted metal tearing against stone. The heavy iron plate groaned, shifting just a fraction of an inch. Suddenly, a sound hissed from the microscopic crack. It wasn't the rush of trapped water, nor was it the putrid smell of toxic methane. It was a rush of cold, perfectly conditioned air. In the middle of a 102-degree heat wave, a blast of air that felt like it had come out of an industrial refrigerator washed over Clara's face, carrying the bizarre metallic scent of ozone and machine oil. Clara froze. She looked up. The farmers at the fence had stopped laughing. Thomas O'Connor lowered his thermos, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What the hell was that?" Bill muttered, the amusement completely wiped from his face. Clara didn't answer. She jammed the crowbar deeper and pushed. It took Clara another hour, using the winch from her grandfather's truck, to fully peel back the massive iron lid. As the metal plate dragged across the dirt, grinding loudly, the gaping maw of the well was exposed to the sun for the first time in nearly 4 decades. The farmers had crept closer, stopping just short of the property line, their mockery replaced by an uneasy silence. Clara walked to the edge and looked down. It was pitch black. The sides of the shaft were lined with standard brick and mortar near the top, but the chilling draft wafting up from the depths was completely unnatural. She picked up a heavy chunk of broken concrete, about the size of a baseball. "Listen closely, Thomas," Clara shouted toward the fence, her voice raspy. "Tell me if this sounds like a dry dirt hole." She dropped the stone directly down the center of the shaft. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The well was incredibly deep, but when the stone finally struck the bottom, there was no splash of water, nor the dull thud of packed earth. Clang! The sound echoed up the shaft, a sharp, ringing impact, like a hammer striking a massive bronze bell. It vibrated through the ground, a hollow metallic resonance that seemed to linger in the dry air for several seconds before fading away. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the cicadas seemed to have stopped buzzing. That sounded like steel," Bill Henderson stammered, taking a step back from the fence. "It's an old irrigation pump," Thomas O'Connor said quickly, though his voice lacked its usual arrogant certainty. "Arthur probably dumped his broken farming equipment down there to save on landfill fees. You're wasting your time, Clara. Cover it back up." But Clara saw the nervous twitch in Thomas's jaw. He was lying. You didn't entomb broken tractor parts under iron and concrete. Clara needed to know what was down there, but she couldn't do it alone. The shaft was too deep, the air too uncertain. That afternoon, she drove into Ashbourne and withdrew the very last of her savings. $4,000 she had kept as an emergency safety net. She hired Leo Dawson, a 30-year-old independent contractor and excavation specialist who was dangerously close to bankruptcy himself. Leo had a reputation for taking jobs no one else would touch, and more importantly, he owed Thomas O'Connor no favors. When Leo backed his heavy-duty rig and mobile crane up to the well the next morning, the crowd at the fence had doubled. The rumor mill in Ashbourne had spun out of control overnight. Some said Clara had found a buried gold stash from the Depression. Others swore she was digging up a toxic waste dump that would poison the entire county. Leo hopped out of his cab, a rugged man with dirt permanently etched into the lines of his face. He peered down the hole with a high-powered flashlight. "I can't see the bottom," Leo muttered, adjusting his safety harness. "Laser measure says it's about 90 feet down. That's absurd for a hand-dug farm well in this region. Water table historically sits at about 40. "Can you get down there?" Clara asked, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "I have a ventilation fan pushing fresh air down, and a multi-gas detector. Assuming I don't hit a pocket of carbon monoxide, the crane can lower me in a bosun's chair. But Clara, I'm charging you $1,000 just to make this drop. If it's just a pile of scrap metal, you're throwing your money into a hole." "Do it," Clara said firmly. The crowd watched in hushed anticipation as Leo swung out over the dark void. The motorized winch whined, slowly lowering him into the earth. Clara stood by the radio on the back of his rig, gripping the microphone, her knuckles white. 10 feet, Leo's voice crackled through the radio. "Brickwork is standard, old but holding up. 30 feet. It's getting freezing down here, Clara, like seeing my breath cold." At the fence, Thomas O'Connor was pacing, furiously dialing a number on his cell phone. 10 minutes later, a white county vehicle kicked up dust down the dirt road. Greg Mitchell, the Ashbourne County Zoning and Safety Inspector, slammed his car door and marched toward Clara. "Ms. Jensen, shut this operation down right now," Greg barked, flashing a badge. "I've received a complaint about an illegal, unpermitted excavation hazard on your property." "I'm inspecting an existing well, Greg," Clara shot back, stepping between the inspector and the crane. "No new excavation. The grandfather clause in the county code exempts pre-1990 agricultural wells from retroactive permitting." Greg sneered. "O'Connor says you're operating a dangerous open pit. I have the authority to halt. 60 feet, Leo's voice interrupted through the radio, tight with confusion. Clara, the brick stops here. The shaft changes. Clara grabbed the radio, ignoring the inspector. Changes how, Leo? It's metal. The whole shaft is lined with seamless, polished steel plating from 60 feet down. It looks like the inside of a missile silo. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers at the fence. Greg Mitchell stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening. 80 feet, Leo breathed over the static. I'm coming up on the bottom, shining my light down. Clara, you need to see this. You really need to see this. What is it, Leo? Is it an old pump? There was a long pause, filled only by the hum of the winch and the rush of the ventilation fan. No, Leo finally replied, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. It's a door, a massive circular vault door set into the floor. And Clara, there's a light coming from underneath it. Something down here has power. The words power and light echoed over the crackling radio speaker, hanging in the oppressively hot Nebraska air, like a physical weight. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody at the fence line moved. Greg Mitchell, the county zoning inspector, who had been shouting just seconds before, stood paralyzed with his mouth half open, the citation pad slipping from his sweaty grip. Thomas O'Connor dropped his expensive sunglasses into the dust, his face losing all its usual arrogant color and turning a sickly, pallid shade of gray. Clara did not hesitate. She snatched the heavy black radio microphone from the truck's dashboard. Bring yourself up, Leo. Do not touch anything down there. I am going down. Clara, wait. This is completely insane. Leo's voice trembled through the static, but the motorized winch was already whining as he initiated his own ascent. You don't understand what I am looking at. It is a literal vault down here. It is glowing green. This isn't a well. It is a bunker. Bring the harness up, Clara repeated, her voice remarkably steady, despite the chaotic hammering of her own heart. As Leo's helmet finally crested the lip of the dark shaft, Thomas O'Connor suddenly broke out of his stupor. He lunged across the property line, his boots stomping heavily over the brittle, dead blackberry vines. His previous smug demeanor had vanished, replaced by a frantic, desperate aggression that Clara had never seen before. You are trespassing on dangerous ground, Clara, Thomas roared, his fists clenched at his sides. This is a biohazard. Your grandfather was illegally dumping experimental agricultural chemicals down there. I know about it. My father knew about it. If you go down there and breach that seal, you will poison the entire county, and I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your life in a federal prison. Stop this immediately. Clara stood firm, stepping squarely between Thomas and the heavy crane rig. She stared directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. If it is just toxic chemicals, Thomas, then why are you shaking? And why does a toxic waste dump have a polished steel door with electricity running to it? Thomas opened his mouth to shout another threat, but Bill Henderson and the Lawson brothers had already crossed the fence line behind him. They weren't laughing anymore. They carried shovels and heavy wrenches, and they formed a quiet, imposing barricade behind Clara. Step back, Thomas, Bill said quietly, his voice carrying the hardened grit of a man who had lost half his livelihood to the drought. The lady is going to look at her property. If you have a problem with it, you can call the sheriff. But you are not laying a hand on Arthur Miller's granddaughter. Thomas sneered, taking a hesitant step back as Leo unbuckled himself from the heavy canvas bosun's chair. Clara quickly stepped into the harness, pulling the thick nylon straps tight over her shoulders and across her chest. She grabbed the heavy flashlight from Leo, clipped the multigas detector to her collar, and gave a sharp, decisive nod. Lower me, she commanded. The world above vanished instantly as Clara dropped below the rim of the concrete casing. The oppressive, suffocating heat of the August morning was immediately replaced by an unnatural, biting cold that seeped through her thin cotton shirt. The sky shrank to a brilliant blue coin far above her head. As the winch steadily lowered her deeper into the earth, the beam of her flashlight swept across the walls. For the first 60 feet, it was exactly as Leo had described: old, meticulously laid red brick, slick with decades of cold condensation. But suddenly, the brickwork abruptly stopped, transitioning flawlessly into thick, riveted panels of brushed steel. It was industrial, heavy-duty, and impeccably maintained. It looked less like a farm well, and more like the access shaft of a Cold War missile silo. 70 feet, Clara whispered to herself, her breath puffing out in white clouds of vapor. The metallic scent of ozone and clean machine oil grew stronger. At 90 feet, her boots touched solid ground. She unclipped the carabiner and stepped out of the harness, her boots echoing loudly on a grated metal floor. The space at the bottom of the shaft widened into a circular chamber, roughly 15 feet across, and there, set directly into the floor beneath her feet, was the vault door. It was a staggering feat of engineering. The circular hatch was at least 6 feet in diameter, constructed from solid titanium and reinforced steel. A soft, pulsating green light emanated from a waterproof electronic display panel set into the center of the metal. Clara knelt beside the heavy door, her hands shaking as she wiped away a thin layer of dust. Next to the glowing green display was an old-fashioned heavy mechanical keyhole surrounded by a brass combination dial. Engraved directly above the dial, in neat, unmistakable cursive, were the words, Miller-Olson Aquifer Protocol, authorized access only. Clara's mind raced. Olson. That was the maiden name of Thomas O'Connor's mother. The two families had been intertwined decades ago, before a bitter, unspoken feud had driven them apart in the late 80s. She remembered the strange, heavy iron key she had found tucked inside her grandfather's leather-bound journal. She had worn it on a silver chain around her neck since the day of his funeral, assuming it was simply a sentimental keepsake to an old tractor or a forgotten safe deposit box. With trembling fingers, she pulled the heavy iron key from beneath her shirt. It felt unnaturally cold. She slid it into the brass lock. It fit perfectly. She turned the key. A heavy mechanical clunk reverberated through the floorboards. The green light on the electronic panel suddenly flashed to a brilliant, blinding blue. A deep, subterranean hum vibrated through the soles of Clara's boots, a sound so powerful and profound that it felt like the very heartbeat of the earth had suddenly awakened. Hydraulic pistons hissed, expelling a cloud of pressurized vapor into the chamber. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive titanium door began to rotate and sink, sliding sideways to reveal a brilliantly illuminated staircase leading further down into the depths. Clara descended the steel staircase, her flashlight completely unnecessary now. The corridor below was bathed in stark, bright, fluorescent light. At the bottom of the stairs, she stepped onto a suspended metal catwalk, and the breath completely left her lungs. She was standing inside a massive, cavernous, subterranean facility. Below the catwalk lay an enormous, rushing underground river of crystal-clear, freezing water. It was an ancient, glacial aquifer, roaring through the bedrock of Nebraska, completely untouched by the catastrophic drought ravaging the surface world above. But it wasn't just a natural wonder. The cavern was filled with millions of dollars worth of advanced industrial-scale water filtration and pumping machinery. Massive steel pipes, high-capacity commercial turbines, and digital flow regulators hummed with quiet, efficient power. Geothermal generators sat humming in the corner, powering the entire facility off the natural heat of the deeper earth. In the center of the main control deck sat a dusty oak desk. Clara ran to it. Strewn across the desk were faded blueprints, geological surveys, and a stack of notarized legal documents. She picked up the top file. The documents outlined everything. In 1986, Arthur Miller and Richard O'Connor, Thomas's father, had discovered this deep-layer superaquifer beneath the Miller farm. They had pooled their resources to build this hidden pumping station, but Richard O'Connor had a sinister plan. He wanted to secretly drain the county's upper water tables, forcing the smaller farms into bankruptcy, while sitting on this endless supply to build an agricultural empire. When Arthur realized his partner's ruthless, monopolistic plan to destroy his neighbors, he locked Richard out. Arthur secured the legal water and mineral rights in an ironclad trust, sealed the access well, and hid the key, sacrificing his own financial success to ensure O'Connor could never weaponize the water supply against the town. Arthur had left the farm to Clara, knowing her background in corporate law and accounting would be the only thing capable of fighting the O'Connor family when the next great drought inevitably hit. Clara looked at the massive red lever on the main control console. The label beneath it read, Surface Irrigation Bypass, Main Grid. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Her grandfather wasn't a stubborn, foolish old man. He was a silent guardian. He had endured decades of mockery, financial ruin, and the ridicule of men like Thomas O'Connor, all to protect the community that was currently dying above him. Clara wrapped both hands around the heavy red lever, braced her boots against the floor, and pulled it down with all her might. Instantly, the cavern erupted in a deafening roar. The massive commercial turbines spun up with a violent, earth-shaking rumble. Millions of gallons of pressurized, ice-cold glacial water surged through the colossal steel pipes, rushing vertically toward the surface grid that had sat dormant for 36 years. Topside, the ground began to tremble violently. Leo Dawson stumbled backward, grabbing the side of his rig to stay upright. Bill Henderson and the Lawson brothers yelled out in alarm. Suddenly, across the barren, cracked expanse of the Miller farm, hundreds of rusted irrigation sprinkler heads burst from the dust. With a sound like a thunderclap, a massive, explosive torrent of pure, freezing water blasted into the blazing summer sky. The farmers screamed in shock as the water rained down upon them, soaking their clothes, turning the dead dust into rich, dark mud. It was a deluge. The farm was flooding with life-giving water, gallons upon gallons shooting relentlessly into the air, creating shimmering rainbows in the brutal sunlight. Thomas O'Connor fell to his knees in the mud, his expensive clothes ruined, his face twisted in absolute defeat. He knew immediately what the trembling earth and the rushing water meant. The secret his father had fought to steal, the monopoly he had tried to secure by bullying Clara, was entirely gone. 15 minutes later, the winch dragged Clara back to the surface. She emerged from the well completely soaked, covered in dust and grease, holding the thick stack of legal documents high in her hand. The farmers rushed to her, cheering wildly, clapping her on the shoulders as they danced in the pouring rain of the irrigation sprinklers. Bill Henderson was weeping openly, letting the water wash over his face. Clara walked straight through the cheering crowd, stopping directly in front of the kneeling Thomas O'Connor. She tossed a copy of the original trust documents into his lap. "My grandfather owned the water, Thomas," Clara said, her voice cutting clearly through the roar of the sprinklers. "And now I own it. I am opening the bypass valves to the county reservoir tomorrow. Every single farm in Ashbourne will have access to this aquifer for free. She leaned in close, her eyes blazing with absolute authority. "Except for you. You will pay triple the market rate for every drop, or your land dries up and blows away. Now get off my farm." Within a week, Ashbourne was saved. The Miller farm transformed into a lush, thriving oasis, and Clara Jensen never returned to Chicago, choosing instead to proudly oversee the legacy and the life-saving waters her grandfather had so fiercely protected. Did Clara's incredible discovery leave you speechless? Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden right beneath our feet, guarded by the unwavering courage of those who refuse to surrender. If you loved this inspiring story of resilience and triumph against all odds, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing true tales. Do not forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you very much.